Right, hi everyone, sorry about that. I'm Delina and I work with Kezia at the Knowledge Transfer Network. I'm the Knowledge Transfer Manager for Innovation Effectiveness, and what that means is, apart from working with our design team, most of my projects are looking at best practices within the innovation landscape, and how we as an organisation can sort of share these best practices primarily internally. So I come from a design background, trained in product and furniture design, and then moved on to service design and innovation. And today, after sort of Kezia's and Nurin's introduction on innovation and partnerships and the sort of UK innovation landscape, as it were, I'm going to talk about how design can be brought into this context. To break this down into three sort of chunks. First, how can you use design to rethink where your company might sit amongst your other stakeholders, and to use this as a mindset to look at potential partnerships, so whether academic or within the industry, because that's what today's about, partnerships to drive innovation. And then we'll look into how you can use design to not only identify problems worth solving, but identify problems worth solving by you as a partner or partnership. And thirdly, I guess no company or no human is an island. So how do you engage individuals, and how do you get groups of people to co-design what you're doing? So looking at the where a company might sit in amongst the stakeholders, and trying to use design to kind of think about supply chains, and very general example of a supply chain. You probably recognize that, very stripped down, but here is where all the stakeholders kind of need or require the outputs or services that are given by the stakeholder before it. So if we start thinking about where value lies in this, well, you can say that value lies where service is traded in any transaction point, I guess. And companies provide their customers with the value they require for a price, so everyone profits in the long run. Any new partnerships that you might want to think of or sort of go towards would probably naturally fit within boxes before or after you as a stakeholder here. And whilst this is incredibly useful, and because you as a customer or you as a provider would be at the front line of giving or receiving feedback, which is always good to have. But if you want to talk in the context of innovation, there's probably a big chance of you discussing things you probably already know about. So no matter how many brainstorms you do and you're thinking about ideas, you probably come up with ideas that are coming from relatively similar foundations. So there was talk about disruptive innovation, radical innovation earlier today with Kezia and Nurin. And if you want to try leading market trends as opposed to probably following it, you want to scope out to the max any new technology, any new markets. And this concept of value web is quite a nice way of thinking about the ecosystem in which your company lies in. So as opposed to the linear framework, or a chain, which was it's a very operational way of thinking, and I guess that it follows an industrial production process or a distribution, but the value webs show a far more dynamic relationship between the different stakeholders. And it's not anything, I mean, businesses are becoming more hyper-connected and collaborative, and again, not just with their direct customers, but with more and more players within their ecosystems. And what this means that it doesn't limit the interactions that take place with the pre-existing relationships. It just means that there's more opportunity to learn, share, and exchange knowledge and concepts between the businesses who might not have thought about collaborating with before. So some of these that might have been doing a good job sharing best practices, they now have an opportunity to work together on next practices. So just to give you an example, if, say, IKEA. So if I were a customer and then I've just moved to Glasgow because I love the city very much and I need a new bookshelf for a new flat, I Google online, look for a bookshelf, click buy, and then hope it gets delivered a couple of days later, already installed. So that's great. But then if I drive around town before I do that, and come across IKEA, so I thought, okay, well, I'll go in, I'll have a look, and you know IKEA, you step in and you're immediately sort of trapped into furniture heaven. It's great, you walk and then you just collect so many different furnitures, and next thing you know, you look like that. And A, you collect the items yourself, B, you drive them back to your houses yourself, and C, you have to install them yourselves. But at the end of the day, you feel pretty good about it because A, you've actually installed it yourself, which for me is actually quite impressive. But B, it looks good. So what you don't actually think about is that how IKEA's business model has used me as a customer, but also as a resource, as an asset. So IKEA, it actively invites customers to play a part in their value web as a customer, I guess, a customer with capacity. And then the capacity is to pick them up, to go to the store, pick up the item themselves, drive, and assemble it at home. So this, I guess, is a very generalized example of how a company can use its customer and think of that as an unlikely relationship, but it gives a nice idea of how unlikely relationships within a service system can actually bring about interesting capacities and qualities that people or that companies can offer, not necessarily based on what things are required or needed. So, good thing about IKEA, they didn't just think about the distribution of their products operationally, they disrupted the market in which furniture is bought. So going back to design and how it can help partnerships identify problems worth solving, and identify problems worth solving by you as well. More and more companies are latching on to adopting design thinking as a process, as an approach to their strategies. And it's an approach adapted from the way so-called expert designers work. And this is a double diamond, which is what the Design Council came up with. And it's generally a framework in which the designers kind of go about doing their projects. So specific tools vary depending on what sort of a designer you want to be called. Generally start at the right, left, right, where they might be given initial brief and then they diverge into discovering mode. So this is where they explore the premise of the brief, they try to understand the context and where it lies, and you might get ethnographic work going, you might get interviews, customer data analysis, primary research, secondary research, what goes on during people's day-to-day lives. And once they've collected this information about, their target audience, they then start to synthesize these into insights. They start to cluster these insights into themes and into opportunities. They sift through what's good, what the juicy bits are. And they converge up to the point of the middle dollar diamond, where they might redefine their brief. So redefine it into something more specific, something that they can take action upon solving or developing. And in a company, if you apply this, it might be looking at what a project might look like and how this could be signed off. But then developing, so diverging back out again, this might be to scope out all of the avenues of developing a different product or service or project and starting to ideate, so coming up with concepts and sort of going to the point where you've got a set of project deliverables to work on, to deliver. So last bit, C, delivery phase. Depending on the concepts, the designers start to implement their ideas. So it's prototyping, testing, reviewing, building. MVPs might be targeted along the way, and then finally the release. But what's also important here is where targets are reviewed and figure out how you can collect or how you can evaluate your process and your output and collect feedback. So where are feedback loops set? And feedback, as was mentioned earlier, feedback's really important because it's what designers love iterating. So they need feedback. They need feedback along the way, and as a company, it's a very agile way of thinking. In order to do this, communication with all the different parties is really important because it means the more transparent the development of your work is, the more open people involved is to changes and instead of sort of freezing to the scope of work. So once you get the culture going and there's openness of making mistakes and learning from these mistakes, you kind of start getting a culture that's ready to improve what you do and ready to innovate. So why is making mistakes important? Well, actually, why is learning about making mistakes important? Because humans are only humans. They make mistakes, and individually, we might think we behave rationally most of the time, but according to the next person, they might just think, what is she doing? So the success of your business depends on the decisions made by human beings. Human beings are irrational. This applies even in a business-to-business market, because at the end of the day, people make decisions. It's really easy to assume what people need or how they behave, but actually one of my favorite sayings of my manager is that if you have to assume what people are doing, you're probably making an ass of you and me, and I strongly believe that. So going back to feedback, you can ask for feedback, you can find out what people think or how they experience different parts of the service and listen, but is listening actually enough? So how do you actually engage people in this development of a process and actually co-create or co-design with them? So a lot of what designers do is they co-design. They facilitate the process for the project, and it's not that they just go off and do it by themselves, but it's getting people to do it with them. And they do this through their natural ability to visualize things, their natural ability to make things, and this being done as a way of communicating not just to other people, but also to themselves. And to themselves, what I mean by that it's one thing listening about how people feel, but it's a whole other thing to trying to physically feel, I don't know, a mental or physical impairment if you don't have it, and how do you actually design for it? So there's empathy tools. How, again, so it's not just impairments, how do you design for someone who might live a completely different personal life to you, a completely different social situation to you? And again, it's really easy to assume, even with sort of customer data analysis, but this actually, so empathy tools, this example was done at the RCA Helen Hamlin Centre, and I think it was working on trying to figure out how does it feel to open a tube of toothpaste with arthritis, and coming up with products that would adhere to that brief. And it might actually be hard, I realise, to fully immerse yourself into the lives of the target audience long enough so that you actually, fully and completely empathise with them. But you can begin to understand the context by at least making an effort to put yourselves in people's shoes. So this example, it's quite, relatively high fidelity, but the point is it can be as quick and as cheap as you want it to be. So going through quick prototyping and engaging with people, stakeholders and users on the bananas, it was a project that a design consultancy called Special Projects did, and it was a brief for Samsung. They wanted to figure out how was the best way to design for the aging population and actually provide mobiles accessible to the elderly. And Special Projects, they got a group of elderly people in and said, right, here's a bunch of fruits and pins and all sorts of funky art craft stuff. Design your perfect solution to a mobile phone. And this is what they came up with. And through that, stories emerged. It wasn't just kind of them going off, making banana mobile sets on their own and coming back and bringing it in with them. The designers actually came and listened whilst the elderly people were actually doing these. And what came from that was the fact that they wanted a mobile phone that you could just talk to and it would do everything for you, including text messages, including, booking something in on your calendar. And the fact is, they just wanted Siri. So it's already there. What they wanted was already there. The fact was that they couldn't actually access the mobile phones. And what they figured out was that it was difficult for elderly people to actually start using phones when they get one. And what came from that was actually a really lovely book that was incorporated within the installation of a mobile phone. So there was SIM cards in one of the pages where it said, this is a SIM card, and put it into this box, which is, the frame of the mobile set. And it took them step by step in a really accessible way for them to actually use phones that don't look like, brick phones that were in the 60s, but actually modern ones. And over here, so that was the sort of development of how people can use this particular product. Here was from a session Early Lab did, and Early Lab was an initiation from UAL, University of the Arts, who worked on early stage of design and innovation, and this project was particularly towards the mental health. So how could youth access services for the mental health. And so what happened there? They worked with students from the university, design, art students. It was very multidisciplinary. And they also worked with various stakeholders of youth mental health centres in Norwich. And this went from frontline service providers to people who were more backstage, so admin, and people who were probably a bit more sort of senior. And what they were trying to do is trying to role play how youth actually do access mental health services, just using architecture models. And it's a great way of just getting people to develop scenarios and, again, visualizing and communicating how they think people either do currently use certain services, but also how they might be able to use current services. And actually members of the youth mental health centres were also taking part in it. So I wanted to put this up just as an example of actually cohesively visualizing any scenarios in which a user or a partner might go through. And it looks like doodles, it kind of is doodles, but it worked. It worked because it was less about saying things, talking about things as a very operational system, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. But it's talking about how people, as human beings, actually go through it, and talking about how some of the experience are sort of expressed in thoughts. Design is too big a subject to be only done by designers. As I said before, there's a lot of things, a lot of preconceptions about traditional design and how they just go off. You give them a brief, they go off and then do them, come back and give you a portfolio, which is great. But what some people don't understand is that it is a way of thinking, and designers can merely just facilitate what you can do yourselves and kind of enable you to have that say in the process. So looking at the three things that I mentioned earlier, rethinking value chains. Well, if it is about market disruption that you want to think about, then you've got to talk to more people. You've got to partner with people who you might not actually necessarily have thought of partnering up with. Identifying problems worth solving. Successful commercialization. It's thinking about, okay, you can solve a problem. Well, are they the right problems? Are they actually going to solve, a really implicit, unmet need? And if they are, then you've got a chance of actually commercializing it and putting whatever you're developing, technology, whatever, into commercialization, and successfully. And bringing other people into the process. How do you effectively do the 2 points above? And how do you do it innovatively? And the good thing is, there is money to do the first stages of what I've just mentioned, and it's the Design Foundations grant. Ben will talk more about this later, so I won't go into it very, very much. And yes, thank you.